Creighton here, 35 years old, and a single dad to my amazing 7-year-old son, Jake. I always thought family meant having each other's backs no matter what. Growing up, my parents preached about family loyalty, but their actions told a different story when it came to my son versus my brother's kids. I never imagined I'd have to make the hardest decision of my life over a simple 4-hour babysitting request. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if family drama hits close to home. Let me set the stage about my family situation so you can understand how things got to this breaking point. I work as a structural engineer for a major construction firm in Seattle, putting in 50 to 60 hours most weeks to provide a comfortable life for Jake and me. The job is demanding but rewarding, and I've managed to build a solid career despite the challenges of single parenthood. Jake's mother, Natalie, walked out on us when he was just 2 years old. We had been married for 4 years when she decided that parenthood wasn't what she had signed up for. She told me one Tuesday evening after I came home from work that she felt suffocated and unable to pursue her dreams. Within 3 weeks, she had filed for divorce and moved to Europe with her new boyfriend, an artist she had met at a gallery showing. The divorce was quick but incredibly painful, leaving me as Jake's only consistent parent. Since then, it's been just Jake and me against the world. He's an incredible kid with bright eyes that light up when he talks about dinosaurs and space. He's thoughtful, a bit shy at first with new people, but deeply affectionate once he trusts you. He struggles a bit with anxiety in new situations, which his therapist says is common for children who've experienced early abandonment. My parents, Harold and Diane, live about 30 minutes away in the suburbs of Bellevue. They're both retired now. Dad was a high school principal for 28 years, and Mom taught elementary school for 3 decades. Growing up, they were strict but fair parents. At least that's what I believed for most of my life. They emphasized education, responsibility, and family values above all else. My younger brother, Paul, lives in the same neighborhood as our parents, with his wife, Stephanie, and their 3 kids. They have twin girls, Lily and Emma, who are 10, and their youngest, Ben, who's 5. Paul followed in Dad's footsteps and works in education administration, while Stephanie is a part-time nurse at the local hospital. Their schedule can be hectic, especially with 3 active children involved in various extracurricular activities. When Jake was born, my parents seemed excited about their new grandson. They visited us in the hospital, brought gifts, and took turns holding him. But looking back, there was always something reserved in their interaction with him compared to how they were with Paul's twins who had been born 2 years earlier. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual about how my parents interacted with our kids. They seemed loving toward Jake, though they didn't see him as often as they saw Paul's children. I chalked this up to proximity, and the fact that Paul had more kids, so naturally they required more attention. My parents always had what seemed like reasonable explanations. They lived closer to Paul. His kids were older and could remember their grandparents better. Or they were helping out because Paul and Stephanie had multiple children to manage. The first time I noticed something truly off was at Jake's 4th birthday party. I had planned a small celebration at our favorite park, with a dinosaur theme, Jake's obsession at the time. I invited family, a few of Jake's preschool friends, and some of my colleagues who had children around Jake's age. My parents showed up an hour late, stayed for just 45 minutes, and brought a small toy car as a gift, not even wrapped, just in a store bag, with the receipt still inside. What made this stand out was that just the previous month for the twins' birthday, they had organized an elaborate party at their house. They spent weeks planning it, complete with custom decorations, a professional cake, and expensive presents, including new bikes and electronic tablets. They sent out formal invitations and even hired a children's entertainer. Still, I dismissed the nagging feeling in my stomach, telling myself I was being oversensitive. Maybe they were just tired that day, or perhaps they had other commitments they couldn't reschedule. I convinced myself not to read too much into one incident. But as time went on, this pattern became harder to ignore. When Jake started kindergarten, my parents couldn't make it to his first day because they had a dental appointment. Yet I later saw Facebook photos of them attending a routine soccer practice for Paul's girls that same week, beaming proudly from the sidelines. I remember watching Jake scan the audience at his first school play, looking for his grandparents who had promised to attend but called last minute to say they weren't feeling well. The disappointed look on his face when he realized they weren't there is something I'll never forget. That same evening, my mother posted photos of her and my father having dinner with Paul's family, apparently feeling well enough for that commitment. These incidents accumulated slowly, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but forming an unmistakable pattern when viewed together. I started to wonder if I was being paranoid, or if there really was a discrepancy in how they treated our children. I wanted to believe the best about my parents, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore with each passing month. Over the next 3 years, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just 1 or 2 incidents that could be explained away. It was a consistent, unmistakable difference in how they approached their relationship with Jake compared to his cousins. My parents never missed a single school event, soccer game, or dance recital for Paul's kids. They would rearrange their schedule, cancel other plans, even postpone vacations to make sure they could attend these events. For Jake, they made it to maybe 1 in 5 events always, with an excuse about other commitments, health issues, or simply forgetting the date despite multiple reminders. When Jake earned Student of the Month in 1st grade, my parents said they couldn't come to the ceremony because it was on a Thursday morning and they had their weekly bridge game. 2 weeks later, they skipped their bridge game to attend Emma's science fair, which was also on a Thursday morning. The differences extended beyond attendance at events. When Paul and Stephanie wanted date nights, my parents eagerly volunteered to watch their children sometimes for entire weekends. They'd create elaborate plans for these visits, taking the kids to museums, movies, and amusement parks. They even converted their home office into a dedicated playroom stocked with toys and games, specifically for when Paul's children visited. The playroom was a particular point of contention. When Jake would visit, he wasn't allowed to disturb certain toys that were special or just for the girls. Once, when he accidentally broke one of Emma's craft projects that had been left out, my mother was visibly upset with him for the remainder of the visit, making comments like, "This is why we can't have nice things when you're here." Meanwhile, when I asked if Jake could stay with them occasionally so I could catch up on work or have a rare evening to myself, there was always hesitation. "We're pretty tired these days," or "We already have plans," became common responses. When I pointed out that they had just watched Paul's 3 children the previous weekend, they'd say, "That's different. We already know their routine." The few times they did agree to watch Jake, he would return home saying, "Grandma and Grandpa just watched television most of the time," or "Grandpa told me to play by myself because he was busy." Once, when I picked him up earlier than expected, I found him sitting alone in the guest room playing on his tablet while my parents were in the living room watching television. They hadn't even checked on him in over an hour. Holiday celebrations highlighted the disparity even more starkly. Christmas and birthdays were particularly painful to witness. Paul's kids received thoughtful, expensive gifts, often exactly what they had asked for, plus additional surprises. Gaming consoles, brand new bikes, designer clothes, elaborate science kits, and once even a custom playhouse for their backyard. Jake, on the other hand, would receive generic gift cards or practical items like school supplies and clothes. One Christmas, they gave each of Paul's children personalized gifts that clearly required weeks of planning, while Jake received a gift card to a bookstore in a hastily signed generic card. The card even had grandson printed on it rather than his name, while his cousins' cards were all individually selected to match their interests. My son, being the sweet kid, he has never complained directly. He would always say thank you and try to show enthusiasm for whatever he received. But I caught the hurt in his eyes when he'd see photos of his cousins with their grandparents on elaborate outings that he was never invited to join, or when he'd hear them talk about the special weekend they'd spent at Grandma and Grandpa camp that somehow never included him. One evening, after scrolling through Facebook and seeing pictures of my parents with Paul's kids at a water park, Jake looked up at me with confusion in his eyes. "Dad, why don't Grandma and Grandpa want to play with me like they play with Lily and Emma and Ben?" he asked, his voice small, but the question enormous. I fumbled through an explanation about them living closer to his cousins and how it was easier for them to spend time with 3 kids at once rather than making separate plans for him. Even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow justifications that didn't address the real issue. I tried addressing the situation subtly with my parents multiple times. "Jake would love to spend more time with you guys," I'd suggest during phone calls. "He really looks up to you both." They'd nod and say, "Yes, we should plan something," but those plans rarely materialized. I even tried scheduling specific dates, which they'd often cancel last minute or cut short compared to the extended time they spent with Paul's children. When I brought up more specific concerns, they'd become defensive. "We don't play favorites, Creighton." My mother insisted when I mentioned the disparity in Christmas gifts. "You're too sensitive. You always have been." My father would add, "Paul's kids are just at easier ages right now. Jake requires more attention, and at our age it's exhausting." Paul seemed oblivious to the situation, or perhaps he chose not to see it. Whenever I hinted at the disparity, he'd dismiss my concerns. "Mom and Dad are getting older. 3 kids is a lot for them to handle at once. So of course they're tired afterward," he'd explain. This explanation made no sense given how eagerly they volunteered to watch his 3 children together for entire weekends, while claiming 4 hours with Jake was too demanding. Besides, Paul would add, with a slight edge to his voice, "My kids know how to entertain themselves. They don't need constant attention." The implication that Jake was somehow more difficult or demanding stung, especially since he was actually an unusually independent and easily contented child. As the pattern continued, I noticed Jake starting to internalize the message that he was somehow less deserving of his grandparents' time and attention. He stopped asking when we would visit them. He became quieter around them, less likely to share his achievements or interests. He was learning to expect less, to need less, to ask for less from people who should have been eager to give him more. That realization broke something inside me. My child was learning to accept being treated as less important than his cousins, and I was allowing it to happen in the name of keeping family peace. The breaking point came 6 months ago, on what should have been an ordinary Wednesday morning. I received an urgent email from our company's CEO. Clients from Japan were making an unexpected visit to Seattle to review our progress on a major high-rise project. As lead structural engineer, my presence at the meeting was non-negotiable. The meeting was scheduled for that Saturday morning from 9 to 1, a time when Jake would normally be at his weekly soccer practice. Thursday evening, I received another email. Jake's soccer practice had been canceled due to unexpected field maintenance. Suddenly, I had a childcare issue for those crucial 4 hours on Saturday. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have been a major problem. I had a reliable network of backup care options. But as luck would have it, my regular babysitter, a college student named Alexis, who Jake adored, was out of town visiting her family. My closest friends all had plans they couldn't change on such short notice. My neighbor, who sometimes helped in emergencies, was recovering from knee surgery. The parents of Jake's school friends were all attending a school fundraiser that morning, which I had declined due to the work meeting. After exhausting all options, I reluctantly called my parents on Friday afternoon. I hadn't asked them to watch Jake in nearly 8 months, not since the last time when they had cut a 3-hour visit down to 90 minutes because they remembered they had dinner plans. "Mom," I said when she answered, trying to keep my tone casual and positive, "I really need a favor. I have an emergency work meeting tomorrow that could save our project. The clients flew in from Tokyo just for this, and I can't miss it. Jake's soccer was canceled, and I've tried everyone else. Could you watch him for just 4 hours on Saturday morning, I'll drop him off with his iPad books and lunch. He's really no trouble these days. He'll probably just read or draw quietly. There was a long pause on the phone, followed by a heavy sigh that immediately made my stomach tighten. Oh, Creighton, Saturday isn't good for us. Your father has his golf game in the morning, and I was planning to get my hair done. Besides, we're just so exhausted lately. You know how it is at our age. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to keep frustration from bleeding into my voice. Mom, it's really important. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. This meeting could determine whether our project continues or gets canceled. 4 hours, that's all I need. Can't you find someone else? Maybe one of Jake's friends' parents. 4 hours is quite a long time for us to be responsible for him. 4 hours is a long time, I repeated, unable to hide my disbelief. You watched Paul's kids overnight last weekend. That's different, she said dismissively. We already know their routine, and they entertain each other. Jake requires constant attention. Mom, Jake is 7. He can entertain himself better than most adults I know. He'll sit and read for hours if you let him. I just don't think tomorrow works for us, Creighton. I'm sorry. I ended the call shortly after a mix of hurt and anger building inside me. I managed to arrange for Jake to join a classmate at the school fundraiser, though it required calling in a favor and promising to reciprocate soon. The solution worked out, but the conversation with my mother lingered in my mind. The very next day, Saturday afternoon after my meeting, I called Paul about borrowing his lawnmower since mine had broken the previous week. During our conversation, he casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, thanks for not asking Mom and Dad to watch Jake this weekend. The kids are staying with them all weekend, while Stephanie and I go to that wine country retreat. They've been planning activities for weeks, baking cookies, going to the science museum, the works. You know how they love their special time with the grandkids." I nearly dropped the phone. All weekend. Starting when? We dropped them off this morning around 8. We'll pick them up Sunday evening. Mom insisted we take the full weekend to ourselves. Isn't that great of them? All weekend. Not 4 hours. All weekend with 3 children, including a 5-year-old with known behavioral issues. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that something broke inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a scheduling conflict. This was a clear message about who mattered and who didn't in my parents' eyes. "Paul," I said slowly, "did you know? I asked them to watch Jake for 4 hours this morning for an emergency work meeting, and they said they couldn't do it. That Dad had golf, and Mom had a hair appointment." There was an uncomfortable pause. "Oh, no, I didn't know that. Maybe they already had plans with us before you asked." I asked yesterday. You just said they've been planning this weekend with your kids for weeks. Why wouldn't they mention they already had plans to watch your kids when I called? I don't know, Creighton. Maybe they forgot. Or maybe they thought watching one more kid would be too much. Right, I said flatly. Because 4 hours with one additional well-behaved 7-year-old would ruin their elaborate weekend plans with your 3 kids. Look, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe just talk to them about it. Oh, I plan to, I replied, ending the call. I spent the rest of that day in a daze replaying years of similar incidents in my mind. Each one now appeared in a new harsh light. This wasn't about convenience or energy levels or proximity. This was about choices, consistent choices, to prioritize one set of grandchildren over another. And my son was paying the emotional price for those choices. That evening, after Jake was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began listing every incident I could remember that demonstrated the pattern. The birthdays, the holidays, the canceled plans, the forgotten school events, the disparity in gifts and attention. Seeing it all written down in one place was like a punch to the gut. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I decided then that something had to change. Not just for my sake, but for Jake's. I couldn't continue allowing him to internalize the message that he was less worthy of love and attention than his cousins. I couldn't keep exposing him to the subtle rejection that was shaping his understanding of his own value. Tomorrow I decided we would have a family meeting. All of us face to face. It was time for some uncomfortable truths to be spoken aloud. I drove to my parents' house Sunday evening, timing my arrival for when I knew Paul would be picking up his children. I had asked him to stay for a conversation, and though he seemed reluctant, he agreed. Jake was at a sleepover with his best friend, giving me the freedom to have this difficult conversation without worrying about him overhearing. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I rehearsed what I wanted to say. I had spent hours thinking about how to approach this without letting emotion overwhelm the message. I needed them to understand the pattern, to see what had been invisible to them but painfully obvious to me. And increasingly, to Jake. When I arrived, Paul's SUV was already in the driveway. Inside, I found a chaotic scene of weekend wrap-up. The living room was strewn with toys, art supplies, and sleeping bags. The kitchen counter held the remains of what appeared to be a cookie baking session. My father was helping Ben tie his shoes while my mother was braiding Emma's hair. Lily was showing Paul the craft project they had made at the Science Museum. It was a scene of comfortable family intimacy that Jake had rarely experienced with his grandparents. I stood in the doorway observing for a moment before anyone noticed me. Creighton, my mother, exclaimed when she finally saw me. "We weren't expecting you. Is everything okay?" "I asked him to come," Paul said, giving me a warning look that clearly said, "Don't make a scene in front of the kids." "I thought we could all talk once the kids are settled," I replied calmly. 20 minutes later, after Paul's family had packed up their overnight bags, handmade crafts, and new toys that my parents had apparently purchased during the weekend, my mother suggested the children watch a movie in the den while the adults talked. "I want to understand something," I said calmly after we gathered in their living room. The same living room where countless family decisions had been made, where holiday gifts had been opened, where I had once felt safe and valued. Why is it that you couldn't watch Jake for 4 hours yesterday for an emergency work meeting, but you're happily watching Paul's kids for an entire weekend for a recreational trip? My mother looked flustered, her hands fidgeting with the napkin she had brought from the kitchen. "That's different, Creighton." "How is it different?" "Well, Paul and Stephanie rarely ask for help, and they needed this break. They work so hard with 3 children. I've asked for help maybe 5 times in 7 years, Mom. I'm a single parent working 50 to 60-hour weeks. If anyone needs occasional support, I would think it would be me." My father jumped in, his tone defensive. "Look, son, the truth is, Paul's kids are just easier. They know our routines. Jake gets anxious here sometimes, and we're not sure how to handle him." "He gets anxious because he barely knows you," I responded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "He gets anxious because he can feel that you don't want him here. Children sense these things even when we think we're hiding them." My mother's next words stunned me. "Maybe if you were a more present father, Jake would be better adjusted. Paul and Stephanie have created such well-behaved children because they have 2 parents who know how to discipline properly." The room went silent. Paul looked uncomfortable but said nothing in my defense. "So, this is about Natalie leaving?" I asked, incredulous. "You're punishing my son because his mother abandoned him, because I'm a single parent doing my absolute best." "We're not punishing anyone," my father said defensively, standing up as if to physically rise above the accusation. "We just have a special bond with Paul's kids. They were born when we were younger, more energetic. We had more to give then. Paul's youngest is only 2 years younger than Jake." I pointed out, my voice steady despite the anger and hurt churning inside me. And you seem to have plenty of energy for weekend museums and amusement parks with them. Ben is different, my mother insisted. He's more independent. He's 5, I said flatly. Jake was reading chapter books at that age, while Ben still needs help tying his shoes. This isn't about independence. The conversation spiraled from there. Years of hidden resentments surfaced like bubbles in boiling water. My parents admitted they'd always found Paul easier to understand than me, that they felt more natural with his children. They claimed I was too sensitive and read into things too much. When I pointed out concrete examples of the disparity in how they treated our children, they dismissed each one with excuses or claimed I was exaggerating. Remember Jake's 6th birthday when you showed up for 20 minutes and gave him socks, I asked. The same month you took the twins shopping and bought them new bikes. We were on a fixed income then, my father claimed, though their financial situation hadn't changed. What about Christmas last year? Paul's kids each got tablets and gaming systems. Jake got a $50 gift card. We didn't know what he wanted, my mother said. I sent you his wish list in November. I reminded you 3 times. Well, we must have misplaced it. Paul finally spoke up, not to defend me, but to suggest I was creating drama and making everything about myself, instead of considering our aging parents' limitations. This isn't about me, I said, turning to face my brother directly. This is about a 7-year-old boy who notices that his grandparents show up for his cousins but not for him. Who sees the difference in how they're treated and wonders what's wrong with him that makes him less lovable. Nothing's wrong with Jake, my mother insisted. We love all our grandchildren equally. Love isn't a feeling, Mom. It's a series of choices and actions. And your choices have consistently shown Jake that he matters less. That's not fair, my father interjected. We've been supportive of both you and Jake. When I challenged, name one time in the past year you've gone out of your way for Jake the way you regularly do for Paul's kids. Their silence was deafening. I looked around the room and saw something clearly. For the first time, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences or innocent oversights. This was a family dynamic so deeply entrenched that they couldn't even see the unfairness of it. Or worse, they saw it but had justified it to themselves for so long that they believed their justifications. I think I've heard enough, I said, finally standing up. You've made your priorities clear for years. I just refused to see it because I wanted to believe better of you. I wanted Jake to have loving grandparents. We are loving grandparents, my mother protested, tears welling in her eyes. You're blowing this out of proportion over one babysitting request. This isn't about one request, I replied, my voice quiet but firm. This is about a pattern that's been consistent since Jake was born. A pattern I've tried to address multiple times only to be dismissed or gaslighted into thinking I was imagining things. I turned to Paul. And you've been complicit in this. You've benefited from their favoritism, while watching my son be treated as an afterthought. What kind of uncle does that make you? As I walked toward the door, my father called after me. So what now? You're just going to leave, angry. What does that solve? I paused, hand on the doorknob. I'm going to think very carefully about what kind of relationship I want Jake to have, with people who have consistently shown him he's less important than his cousins. Because right now, I'm not seeing how that relationship benefits him at all. I left without another word, the sound of my mother's protests fading as I closed the door behind me. In my car, I sat for several minutes, hands shaking slightly. As the adrenaline of confrontation wore off, I had said things I'd been holding back for years, things I couldn't unsay. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, I felt something unexpected clarity. And with that, clarity came resolve. The relationship between my parents and Jake needed to change fundamentally, or it needed to end. I was no longer willing to subject my son to the subtle rejection he had experienced for most of his life. He deserved better, and if my parents couldn't provide, that I would need to make some difficult decisions. I left my parents' house that night with a new sense of clarity. The raw emotion of the confrontation had burned away years of making excuses for their behavior, leaving behind only the undeniable truth my parents had consistently chosen to be fully present. Grandparents for Paul's children, while offering Jake only the leftovers of their time, attention, and affection. Over the next week, I spoke with my therapist, Dr. Renee, whom I'd been seeing since my divorce. She helped me process my feelings and consider my options objectively. What matters most here is protecting Jake's emotional well-being, she said during our session. Children internalize rejection, especially from family members. They believe it reflects their worth. Her words resonated deeply with me. I thought about how Jake's face would light up when my parents did pay attention to him, how eagerly he tried to please them with good behavior and achievements, and how quietly disappointed he'd become when they'd cut visits, short or cancel plans. He was learning that he was somehow less deserving of love than his cousins, that he had to work harder for scraps of affection that came effortlessly to Lily, Emma, and Ben. "What are my options here?" I asked her. "You could continue trying to address this with your parents, perhaps with family therapy," she suggested. "Or you could accept the limitations of the relationship and manage your and Jake's expectations accordingly. Or you could create stronger boundaries, including possibly limiting contact if that's what's best for Jake's emotional health." I spent the weekend weighing these options, observing Jake closely as he played Red and went about his normal activities. I noticed how confident and relaxed he was at home, and with my friends, who had become his surrogate aunts and uncles. I contrasted that with the anxious people-pleasing behavior he exhibited around my parents, always trying harder, always receiving less. By Monday morning, I had made my decision. I called my attorney, Sandra, and made an appointment for that afternoon. What my parents didn't know was that 5 years ago I had purchased a vacation property on the lake that had been in our family for generations. My grandfather had been forced to sell it during financial hardship, and I'd managed to buy it back through hard work and careful saving, holding it in an LLC to maintain privacy. My parents had often spoken nostalgically about how they wished that property had stayed in the family, unaware that I now owned it. They also didn't know that after my early career success, I had created a substantial trust that named them as beneficiaries for their elder care should they need it. Despite their comfortable retirement, they had made some poor financial decisions in recent years and were more financially vulnerable than they admitted to anyone, including Paul. "I need to make some changes to my estate planning," I told Sandra when we met. "Significant changes. My lawyer helped me remove my parents as beneficiaries from everything: my will, my life insurance, the elder care trust. We transferred the lake property solely into Jake's future inheritance trust with me as the trustee until he reached adulthood. I also contacted the family attorney who had handled my grandparents' estate to ensure there was no misunderstanding about assets they might have assumed would come their way. This isn't about revenge," I explained to Sandra when she asked if I was certain about these changes. "This is about aligning my legal and financial affairs with the reality of our relationship. If they choose to be peripheral figures in Jake's life, then they don't get to benefit from the success I've built while raising him alone." 2 weeks after the confrontation, I invited my parents to meet for coffee at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. I didn't want this conversation to happen in their territory where old patterns could easily reassert themselves, or in my home, which I wanted to preserve as a safe space for Jake. They arrived looking nervous, my mother clutching my father's arm as they entered the cafe. I had selected a table in the corner, away from other patrons, and ordered black coffees for all of us. "Thank you for coming," I said, as they sat down, my tone professional and controlled. "Creighton, we've been so worried," my mother began. "You haven't returned our calls, and Paul said you've been distant with him too." "I needed time to think," I replied, "to consider what's best for Jake moving forward." I pulled out an envelope from my briefcase and placed it on the table between us. "I've come to a difficult decision," I told them calmly. "I can no longer allow Jake to be treated as less important than his cousins. It's damaging him in ways that will take years to undo. Since you've made it clear that you aren't interested in having a meaningful relationship with him, I'm creating appropriate boundaries. I slid the envelope across the table. I've removed you from all financial and legal connections to Jake and me. The lake property you've been asking about is now solely in Jake's trust. The financial safety net I created for your elder care has been dissolved. I've also withdrawn my permission for you to pick Jake up from school or activities as emergency contacts. My mother's hand trembled as she opened the envelope and scanned the legal documents inside. You can't be serious. This is an overreaction to one babysitting request. It's not about one request, I said firmly. It's about 7 years of consistent choices that showed Jake he matters less. I won't allow that message to continue. This is extortion, my father said, his face reddening as it always did when he was angry. You're using money and property to punish us. No, I'm aligning my legal and financial affairs with the reality of our relationship. You've chosen to be peripheral figures in Jake's life, so I'm adjusting accordingly. What about Paul's children? My mother asked, her voice rising slightly. They're innocent in this. You'd cut them off from their cousin. Jake can still see his cousins at school and community events. I'm not preventing that relationship, but I won't force Jake to attend family gatherings where he's treated as an afterthought. And what will you tell Jake? My father demanded. That his grandparents don't love him. Is that the message you want to send? I'll tell him the truth in age-appropriate ways, I replied. That sometimes people aren't able to give us what we need, even family, and that it's okay to create distance from relationships that make us feel bad about ourselves. We don't make him feel bad about himself, my mother protested. We love Jake. Your version of love isn't enough, I said simply. He deserves better. As I stood to leave, my mother grabbed my arm. You'll regret this when you calm down. Family is forever, Creighton. I looked her directly in the eyes. That's exactly my point, Mom. Jake is my family, forever, and I will always put him first. I walked out of the cafe with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The decision had been painful, but necessary. For the first time since Jake was born, I felt like I was truly protecting him from harm, even though that harm came from people who should have loved him unconditionally. On the drive home, I made mental notes about the practical aspects of this decision. I would need to update Jake's school records, find new emergency contacts, and most importantly, have an age-appropriate conversation with my son about the changes in our family relationships. I wasn't cutting my parents off to punish them. I was creating boundaries to protect Jake from further emotional damage. That evening, I called Paul to let him know about my decision, not because I needed his approval, but because it would affect his children's relationship with their cousin. You've gone completely overboard, he said angrily. Mom called me crying. Do you have any idea what you've done to them? I know exactly what I've done. I replied calmly. I've prioritized my son's emotional well-being over maintaining a relationship that hurts him. You might consider what message your children are receiving by watching how their grandparents treat their cousin. My kids have nothing to do with this, he snapped. They're learning that it's okay to treat some family members as less important than others. Is that really what you want them to learn? His silence told me he hadn't considered this perspective before. Look, I continued more gently. I don't want the kids to lose their relationship. Jake loves his cousins, but I won't put him in situations where the contrast in how he's treated is so painful for him to witness. After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room looking at family photos on the wall. I removed several that included my parents not out of spite, but because I didn't want Jake constantly reminded of a relationship that had caused him pain. As I tucked the photos into a drawer, I felt like I was closing a chapter of our lives, making room for new relationships that would nurture rather than diminish my son's sense of self-worth. The weeks following our coffee shop meeting were filled with text messages and voicemails from my parents, ranging from angry accusations to tearful pleas. They seemed to cycle through the stages of grief, moving from denial. "You're overreacting to anger. How dare you do this to us," to bargaining. "We'll try harder with Jake if you'll reconsider." I responded, minimally maintaining firm boundaries, while avoiding unnecessary cruelty. When they asked to see Jake, I didn't refuse outright, but set clear conditions. Any visit would be supervised, limited in duration, and contingent on their behavior toward him being consistently warm and engaged. "We don't need supervision to visit our own grandson," my father protested during one tense phone call. "Past experience suggests otherwise." I replied calmly, "These are my terms. Take them or leave them." They enlisted Paul to call me, and he vacillated between demanding I apologize and trying to negotiate a compromise. At first, his approach was confrontational. "You're being incredibly selfish," Paul said during one call. "Mom can barely sleep. Dad's blood pressure is through the roof. All because you couldn't find a babysitter for one day. That's still all you think this is about?" I replied, realizing how deeply my brother had bought into our family's dynamics. "Have you ever once noticed how differently they treat our kids? My kids are easier to manage because they have consistent parenting from both Stephanie and me." He shot back, echoing our mother's hurtful words. "You know what, Paul, I'm done explaining myself to people who refuse to see what's right in front of them." As weeks passed, however, Paul's tone gradually shifted. During a chance encounter at the grocery store, he seemed less certain of his position. "Lily asked why Jake doesn't come to family dinners anymore," he admitted, looking uncomfortable. I didn't know what to tell her. "What did you say?" I asked. "That sometimes grown-ups need space to figure things out." He hesitated. "She said she noticed Grandma and Grandpa treat Jake differently. Kids pick up on more than we think, I guess." It was the first acknowledgement from anyone in my family that the disparity in treatment was real and not just my perception. I felt a small measure of vindication, though it brought no joy. The extended family soon got involved as news of our rift spread through the family grapevine. Aunts and uncles called to tell me I was being harsh. Cousins sent messages saying I'd gone too far. Most hadn't witnessed the years of subtle rejection Jake had experienced, so their judgment came from incomplete information. Only my mother's sister, Aunt Linda, reached out with a different perspective. She invited me to lunch away from family ears and shared her observations. "I've seen how they treat Jake compared to Paul's kids for years," she told me over soup and sandwiches. It always bothered me, but I didn't feel it was my place to say anything. "What you're doing takes courage." "It doesn't feel like courage," I admitted. "Most days it just feels painful." "That's how you know it's the right kind of courage," she replied. "The kind that costs you something." Aunt Linda became an unexpected ally, occasionally taking Jake for outings and making sure he knew he had extended family who valued him. Her consistent presence helped ease the transition as our family dynamics shifted. My parents attempted reconciliation on their terms. They invited Jake and me to Sunday dinner, showing up at our door unannounced with his favorite dessert. They bought him an expensive gaming system out of the blue, having it delivered with a card saying how much they missed him. They suggested a family vacation, offering to pay for everything. But in all their gestures, there was never an acknowledgement of the real issue or an apology for their behavior. It was as if they thought they could buy their way back into our lives without addressing the core problem that they saw Jake as deserving less than his cousins. "We're trying, Creighton," my mother said during one of their unannounced visits. "Why can't you see that?" "I see you trying to restore the relationship on your terms," I replied, "but I don't see you acknowledging how your actions have hurt Jake all these years." Meanwhile, Jake noticed the change in our routine. At first, he asked occasional questions about why we didn't visit his grandparents as often. After a few weeks, the questions became more direct. "How come we don't go to Grandma and Grandpa's anymore?" he asked one evening as I tucked him into bed. I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes buddy people don't treat us with the respect we deserve, even family members. I've decided we need some space from Grandma and Grandpa while they think about how they've been acting. Is it because they don't want to play with me like they play with Lily, Emma, and Ben? He asked, his perception far more accurate than I had realized. His question broke my heart but confirmed I'd made the right decision. You deserve people in your life who are excited to spend time with you, Jake. People who make you feel special and loved, not like an obligation. Like Mr. Rodriguez next door who teaches me chess, he asked, referring to our elderly neighbor who had taken a genuine interest in Jake's development. Exactly like that, I said, smiling at his understanding. And like Uncle David and Aunt Sarah. These were close friends who had become Jake's honorary aunt and uncle, showing up consistently for school events and spending quality time with him. Jake thought for a moment, then nodded. I like people who really want to be with me better anyway. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, kissing his forehead and turning out the light. The most unexpected consequence came 3 months after our cutoff. My father had a minor heart scare, nothing serious. But it required an overnight hospital stay for observation. In the past, I would have been the one managing his care, coordinating with doctors and handling insurance paperwork. I had always been the family member who dealt with medical issues, having a better understanding of the healthcare system through my own research when Jake had early childhood asthma. Paul was completely overwhelmed by these tasks, having always left them to me. I learned about my father's hospitalization, not from my family, but from Aunt Linda, who called to let me know what had happened. I visited the hospital briefly, keeping my interaction with my parents polite but distant. In the hallway outside my father's room, I ran into Paul, who looked frazzled and exhausted. I don't know how you did all this stuff, he admitted, gesturing to the stack of forms in his hands. I'm drowning in paperwork and calls to the insurance company. Mom's useless right now, just crying and not listening to what the doctors are saying. It's what I've always done, I said simply. You just never noticed. For the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes about the uneven distribution of family responsibilities that had always existed between us. I had been the one to manage our parents' health care, help them with technology issues, assist with financial paperwork, and handle family emergencies, all while working full-time and raising Jake alone. Paul had enjoyed the benefits of being the favorite son without having to shoulder any of the practical burdens. Do you need help understanding those forms? I offered, not willing to take over but open to providing guidance. He hesitated, pride warring with practical need. Maybe just a quick explanation of the insurance terminology. We sat in the cafeteria for 20 minutes as I walked him through the basics of deductibles, co-benefits, and out-of-network charges. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, stripped of defensiveness and focused on solving a practical problem. As we parted, he said awkwardly, "Thanks. And, I've been thinking about what you said. About the kids, noticing how Jake is treated differently. Emma asked me last week why Grandma buys her new clothes, but gave Jake hand-me-downs for his birthday. I didn't have a good answer. I nodded, not needing to drive the point home further. Kids see more than we give them credit for." That brief exchange gave me hope that perhaps Paul was beginning to question the family dynamics he had benefited from for so long. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of his role in enabling our parents' favoritism, but it was a small crack in his certainty that I was the one creating problems. As months passed, we settled into a new normal. Jake and I created new traditions and surrounded ourselves with chosen family people who showed up consistently and treated him with the love and attention he deserved. My close friends stepped up even more, becoming the village that helped raise my son. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it began to fade as we filled our lives with genuine connections rather than strained obligations. And in that space, Jake began to flourish in ways I hadn't anticipated, showing more confidence and less anxiety about whether people truly wanted him around. A year has passed since that fateful 4-hour babysitting request that brought years of unequal treatment into sharp focus. The journey hasn't been easy, but the changes in Jake have confirmed that the difficult decision to create boundaries with my parents was the right one. He's more confident now, less eager to please at the expense of his own needs, and more secure in expressing his thoughts and feelings. Jake and I have created new traditions and surrounded ourselves with people who value us equally. My close friends have become his honorary aunts and uncles, showing up for school plays, soccer games, and science fairs with genuine enthusiasm. His soccer coach, his art teacher, our elderly neighbor who teaches him chess, these people show up consistently and joyfully for him, demonstrating what healthy adult relationships with children should look like. The contrast between these relationships and what he experienced with my parents has been educational for both of us. Jake has learned that he deserves attention and affection without having to earn it through perfect behavior or exceptional achievements. I've learned that family can be chosen, not just inherited, and that sometimes the healthiest thing we can do for our children is to shield them from relationships that diminish their sense of worth. I've continued therapy, working through my own childhood experiences of always feeling second best to Paul. Dr. Renee helped me recognize patterns I had normalized growing up, how I had always worked harder for parental approval that came effortlessly to my brother. I realized that by standing up for Jake, I was also finally standing up for my younger self, the boy who had accepted unequal treatment as something he deserved. "You're breaking the cycle, Doctor," Renee told me during a recent session. "That's one of the hardest and most important things a parent can do." 3 months ago, I received a letter from my parents that was different from their previous attempts at reconciliation. The tone was reflective rather than defensive, acknowledging specific instances of favoritism without excuses or justifications. They asked if I would consider meeting with a family therapist together, a sign they were finally taking the situation seriously rather than expecting us to simply move past it. "We've been doing individual counseling," the letter explained. "Our therapist has helped us see patterns we weren't aware of. We understand now that our actions hurt Jake in ways we didn't intend, and we want to make amends if you'll allow us the opportunity." After discussing it with my own therapist and carefully considering whether it would benefit Jake, I agreed to family therapy, but with clear boundaries. Jake would not participate in the initial sessions, and any future relationship would depend on consistent change, not temporary improvements that reverted once they felt forgiven. We've had 2 sessions so far. I'm cautiously optimistic but firm in my boundaries. The therapist, Dr. Myers, has created a space where difficult truths can be spoken without the conversation devolving into defensiveness or accusations. My parents have begun to recognize how their behavior affected Jake, though they still struggle with fully owning the pattern without making excuses. "We never meant to hurt him," my mother said during our last session. "Impact matters more than intent." Dr. Myers reminded her gently, "And patterns speak louder than individual incidents. They can earn back a place in our lives, but it will be on new terms with clear expectations about how Jake deserves to be treated. I've made it clear that I'm not interested in surface reconciliation that maintains the same underlying dynamics. Real change requires acknowledging the problem, understanding its impact, and committing to consistent long-term behavioral shifts." Paul and I have had several difficult but productive conversations over the past year. The family crisis forced him to recognize privileges he'd always taken for granted. Note: when our father was briefly hospitalized, Paul experienced firsthand the practical and emotional labor I had shouldered for years while receiving less familial support. "I never realized how much you did for everyone," he admitted during a rare brothers-only lunch, "or how different things were for us growing up." He's making efforts to ensure his children understand the importance of treating their cousin with kindness and inclusion. Last month, he insisted that his daughters invite Jake to their birthday party, rather than allowing our parents to plan a separate family-only celebration as they had suggested. It was a small but significant step toward changing entrenched patterns. Most importantly, Jake is thriving. Without the subtle undercurrent of rejection from his grandparents, he's become more confident and secure. His teacher commented at our last conference that he's taking more risks in class volunteering answers and sharing ideas without the hesitation he showed last year. He no longer questions why he isn't good enough for certain family members' attention. He's developed deeper friendships inviting classmates over without the anxiety he used to feel about whether they truly wanted to spend time with him. His pediatrician noted that his stress-related stomachaches, which used to occur weekly, have all but disappeared. The hardest lesson I've learned through this journey is that sometimes protecting your child means making painful decisions that others won't understand. It means being willing to be the bad guy in someone else's story. It means prioritizing your child's emotional well-being over maintaining relationships that may look fine on the surface, but cause damage beneath. It also means examining your own childhood experiences and breaking cycles that may have seemed normal because they were all you knew. The patterns my parents established with me, always favoring Paul's needs and achievements over mine, were replicated in how they treated our children. By refusing to accept this for Jake, I was also finally acknowledging that it had never been acceptable for me either. True family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's built through consistent love, respect, and showing up when it matters. I'll never regret choosing Jake's emotional well-being over maintaining a facade of family harmony that came at his expense. If you're facing similar family dynamics, remember this. Your child is watching how you allow others to treat them, and they're learning their worth from these observations. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is draw a line that says, "This is not acceptable. We deserve better." Because when you genuinely value yourself and your child, others will either rise to that standard or reveal that they don't belong in your inner circle. The family we choose can be stronger than the family we're born into. And that realization, though initially painful, ultimately set both Jake and me free. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your child's emotional well-being? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about navigating complex family dynamics. Don't forget to share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries even with family. Thank you for listening, and remember you're not alone in these struggles. Together we can break generational patterns and create healthier relationships for our children.